So with me today is Mary-Jayne Rust. Mary, welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio. And you've written a book that I really enjoyed reading called Towards an Ecopsychotherapy. And we'll mainly be talking about that. But first of all, I thought it would be great to find out how you found yourself in this field, how you got here.
Well, it's a very long story how I got here. I'll try and just give you the headlines. So I grew up in the country. My dad was a miller. So I was very much embedded in the farming community. But I'd always had a very strong interest in psychology. So piece those things together and you can understand that later on, when I discovered the field of ecopsychology, I was absolutely overjoyed. But one of the things that I got very involved with being in my own therapy and training and so on. And then I went and spent some time in Ladakh, a traditional culture on the Tibetan plateau in 92 and 93. And it was there where I met someone called Helena Norberg Hodge, a Swedish woman who was had set up a green NGO looking at the rapid transition for the local people, as is happening all over the world with traditional cultures moving suddenly into Western culture and all the difficulties that happen. And she was very interested in the psychological dimension of that as well. And I stayed with her, and she's a bit of a missionary, and she pointed out all the terrible things that were happening, including glaciers melting. And I knew about that stuff, but actually it was there that it moved from my mind down into my body, and I really felt it. When I came home, I felt a bit like a cat on hot bricks. What am I to do with this information, this felt information? And in the end, I met up with a number of other therapists who felt the same way, because most of my colleagues thought I was mad at that point, because it wasn't in the news or anything, climate change. I don't know that climate change was even a word at that point. And we got together, and in a sense, that was our training together. We read together, we experimented running workshops together, we went on residentials with someone called Joanna Macy, who was still is a leader in that field, and John Seed, rainforest activist. Okay. And that just was fantastic. It was fantastic. And I knew that was my thing. And then from then on, I kind of developed it in lots of different ways. I've done lots of public speaking and run trainings and courses, and found ways to bring it into my individual therapy practice.
That's what a list of I didn't realize you'd been to Tibet, and Joanna Macy and John Seed, both people that I've very much come across in the domain of sort of climate change and ways of dealing with it emotionally, but I didn't realize that there was that strong connection in ecotherapy as well. But it would be good to get a sense of exactly what area you're specifically talking about. And in the book, you do a great job of clarifying or distinguishing between ecotherapy, the bigger field, ecopsychology, and then ecopsychotherapy. And so I was wondering if for our listeners and viewers, if you could do that same kind of clarification process.
Well, I'll start with ecopsychology, because that is really the field of study, which emerged, I would say it probably started emerging in the mid-1900s, but as an actual word, it emerged in the mid-1990s with an anthology edited by Theodore Roszak and Mary Gomes and Alan Canner. And that's still today a really well worth reading anthology, because all the chapters are written by leading thinkers in the field, and they've gone on to write books. So it's really the study and inquiry into our human relationship with the other than human world. That's it in a nutshell. And a very core belief is that we have become disconnected from the natural world. We've withdrawn, I think is probably a better word. As Western culture, of course, that's happened over millennia, or centuries. So it's a bit like frogs getting used to boiling in water, that we've got used to this disconnection and the paradigm that we are apparently separate and superior to our relatives. And ecopsychology is a response to that, and is saying, actually, it's traumatizing for humans to be so disconnected. We spent most of our life as a species embedded in nature and with an intimate knowledge of the other than human world. And suddenly, it almost like if you saw human species in a 24-hour clock, in the last second, we've lost it. And that is not just a physical impact, it impacts us psychologically and spiritually. And in fact, if you look at what happens to indigenous cultures around the world, the few of them that are left, and you hear them speaking about being torn from their land, you know that actually it drives humans mad to be torn from their land. But it's so difficult for us to see that in ourselves because there's so many other things going on. So the question for ecopsychologists is, so how do we reconnect? We're never going to go back and live as hunter-gatherers. So what does it mean to reconnect with the other than human world in our modern lives? And it's a very complex question, and I think there's lots of different answers to that. So then there's the practice of ecotherapy is the practice of ecopsychology, and there's lots of different forms of that: wilderness therapy, equine assisted therapy, horticultural therapy, actually, which has been going on for a long time. And in all of these different manifestations, it's recognizing the healing power of nature for humans, how it soothes, it gives us a form of self-soothing, it helps us become more embodied, it regulates our emotions. So in a sense, that's what horticulture therapy was all about. Just take people out into nature and get them growing their vegetables, and they will automatically get better. So ecotherapy uses that healing quality. Ecopsychotherapy is more like taking psychotherapy outdoors. Mm-hmm. And I forgot to add that, of course, all those other forms of ecotherapies are practiced outdoors, and it's a big thing. You know, this only happens outdoors. As an ecopsychotherapist, I would say it's also about what happens internally. So just as we might internalize mother or father, what about how do we internalize the earth? How do we internalize rock or water? Do they live in our inner worlds? Of course they do, because it's a microcosm in a sense that reflects the macrocosm. But in the world of psychotherapy, it's all about human relationships and how we internalize our human carers, you know, our parents, etc. Ecopsychotherapy extends that and says, actually, we have a relationship with everything from the moment we're conceived. You know, we're conceived into water, yes, in the womb. And then we're all born onto a piece of land. Many people experience grief for the first time when their animal companion dies as a child. It's a huge thing. Alternatively, some people who live in dysfunctional families and don't get the love that they need maybe only experience unconditional love from animals or plants, actually. So you can get more of a flavor, you know. Also, of course, the natural world comes to us through our dreams and in many, many different ways. So I would say it's not necessarily about being outdoors. Actually, it's about conceiving of ourselves in a different way. We are not just human related, even though they remain, of course, central because we're humans.
Thank you so much. That is really clear and comprehensive, and I think it would. I love the parts of your book where you talked about you explain how this works in a clinical setting when you go outside with someone. And it would be lovely if you could give us a sense of a couple of aspects of that. I loved the story, and I think I can't remember if it was Linda or Tina, one of your clients, who's obviously those names were chosen for them. They are not the names of the real people. But the story about the squirrels and the spiders, that story, I think, is such an excellent example of the benefits of taking the conversation, the dialogue outside.
Okay, so I was starting out practicing outdoors. It was a huge step for me. I'd been trained to work indoors, and of course there's a very strong ethic in the world of psychotherapy that you work in a room which is the container for highly confidential, highly sensitive material. So there is always an issue of confidentiality when you're working outdoors, especially if you're working in a public space. So I had lots to think about, but I really was excited by the idea of doing it. And actually one day, one of my clients, who was very interested in the field of ecopsychology, and she knew that I was, because I give talks and, write articles and so on. And she asked me, can we meet outdoors? And we'd been meeting for several years already. And I said, yes, let's talk about it a bit first and how we're going to do it. So we did. And then one day we just decided, yes, we're going to do it. And it was a little bit strange for me because I was so used to opening the door and, not having any social contact. You just sit down and then the session begins. There's a whole ritual really about how you start a session and how the room is a sort of sanctuary, really. In any case, we met and at the start of the woods beside where I live. I invited her to find us a spot to sit in, and we settled next door to each other, which of course was also very different, under a great oak with our backs against the oak. And immediately I just felt, wow, this is really different. Not only is my client supported, I feel really supported by being in the woods and by the tree has got my back. This was such a different experience of practicing as a therapist. But it was also a little unnerving to be side by side. We just had to kind of invent it as we went along. And for several sessions, the dialogue was much the same as it had been indoors. And I was thinking, well, so am I meant to be doing something different here? Then one day, she dropped into one of her silences, which she used to do a lot indoors. And it was very, very difficult because it was a very tense silence. And I would try and say things to see if I could bring her out of the silence. And usually it didn't work. Anyway, I did that outdoors. And we would fall back into silence again. And then suddenly we saw these squirrels chasing each other around the tree. And so I said, I smiled and she smiled. And I said, does it feel like I'm chasing you with my words? And she smiled. In other words, yes. So we fell into silence again. But it was had a very different quality of silence outdoors because it's never silent outdoors. There's the wind and the trees and the birds and all kinds of things are going on, activities around us. So it didn't have that sense of tension that was, somehow an arid silence indoors. Anyway, we went on and it was towards very much the end of the session and we both looked down at the same time and we saw the tiniest of spiders weaving a web between our arms. Magical. And we both looked up at each other and it was we just both knew somehow this spider was building a bridge between us that I couldn't have done with my words. I didn't do with my words, but we were together. And it felt very different. It felt much more relaxed. And then she said, well, what are we going to do at the end of the session? How are we going to break the web? And I just sort of shrugged my shoulders. I didn't know what to do. Anyway, the end of the session came, we both looked down, the spider was gone, the web was gone.
That's magical.
It was completely magical. And there were, there have been other times too where I remember she was deep in the middle of a process of grief after losing her mother. And she said, there is no new life. How you feel when you're right in the midst of grief. And an acorn dropped in her lap as if to say, oh, yes, there is. And we had, there are so many occasions like that. And it's quite difficult pulling out these examples because I think it makes people think these incredible things happen all the time. And I don't really want to give that impression, but I do want to say that actually lots of things, lots of synchronicities do happen when you practice outdoors. And of course, it's much more difficult for them to happen indoors. So there is a way in which it's like a moment of grace when that happens. It's like we're reminded that we are part of something sacred together, all together.
And you describe nature as the co-facilitator in these encounters, and you have a lovely section about asking permission and how your clients responded to that process of you suggesting that asking permission might be appropriate. So
this is something really that came to me fairly early on when I was trying to work out how to do this practice. And I decided that just like we have opening the door for entry into my house and then going up into my room and closing the door, that it would be good to create a threshold, which sort of indicated that we were now in session. And one of the things I do before we start is to say, once we've crossed that threshold, everything and everyone that comes to us is part of the session and holds meaning, as if we're in a dream. So as it does in the therapy session, that's how you would treat it anyway. But so before we cross the threshold, we ask the forest, which is a community of trees, a community of beings, can we enter for our healing work, or words, whatever words we want to use. And I suggest to my client that we both do this. We might do it out loud, we might just do it in our minds, and we really listen for a response and see what the words have to say back. And I have never had a no yet, but you never know. But I think what it does is it reminds us both that we are in reciprocal relationship with all life, and because otherwise ecotherapy can become yet another form of Western consumerism, that we go into nature to get healed and take what we want and go home again with no thought of, well, do we give back? So I think that asking the permission of the trees or the space, however anyone wants to do it, is a reminder that we don't just go in and plunder.
It's one of the aspects of your book that I found particularly sensitive and thought-provoking, and I think it aligns with this idea of this kind of Western tradition of being somewhat exploitative, of just taking what we want for something, is that you're very, very cautious about any way in which a cultural appropriation could seem to be involved in this process. Because I think your view, and it's my view, have this sense of an animate earth, that there is, well, for me, I feel that there is something within, sort of the trees, the plants, as well as the birds and insects and mammals and so on, and that could seem to be part of someone else's and new animistic tradition. But so you're very, very wary about not taking from another culture.
It's an ongoing exploration, really, as to how we do that. And as you can imagine, certainly in the States, in the world of ecopsychology, people are busy borrowing native ceremonies and practices for reconnection with nature. And many of them have been given permission to do so by Indigenous people. I've worked with someone over here who was given permission by a Native American to perform ceremony. She is much older, and there are the sort of grandparents in the field who wouldn't call themselves ecopsychologists because they've been doing this for ages. They don't need that term. But things have moved on, and my colleagues in the States tell me that Native peoples are a bit sick of white people coming to their ceremonies and some of them taking without permission. And you can understand, after everything that has happened for them, then to have their most precious spiritual practice taken without due respect is just awful. And while there are many people who do it with respect, I can understand their wish to just put their foot down and say, no, actually, no white people can do this. That leaves us it certainly leaves people in the States in a quandary. How do we re-find our roots? And there's quite a few of my colleagues over here who were talking about finding our own Indigenous roots.
Yes, they're going back to a Celtic tradition, or
the Celtic tradition, or whatever. There's many different traditions to choose from. I think that's very exciting. Again, I have questions about using the word Indigenous, because even though in lay terms it means you are from this land, actually in political terms, Indigenous peoples grow up in an intact culture and have all kinds of traditions, which in a sense, that's what makes them Indigenous. It's not just being born onto a piece of land. It's about having stories. It's about having crafts. It's about having an intact cosmology. It's about knowing how to be with other people and with yourself. I mean, there's just so much involved, and we can't possibly get there because we haven't grown up in it.
Yes.
So politically, I don't think it's right. And I've been told by Indigenous friends that they don't think it's right either for us to call ourselves Indigenous. It's a bit like a white person suddenly saying, oh, well, actually, I'm black. You can't. But we can take steps towards reclaiming our own traditions. I don't see the need to call it Indigenous. I just say, actually, we can recreate an intimate relationship with the rest of life. We can look at our own traditions. We can bring back storytelling. We can bring back all sorts of practices in relation to the land. And that's happening. I just think we have to be careful not to appropriate other cultures.
Yes, I think it is happening. I mean, I was quite excited by the courses which American listeners might not necessarily, well, many English listeners probably won't know about, the courses that are available at Schumacher College, for example, which
Yes.
Which enable people to get back to be engaged in an ecological community, and very much sort of like within the soil, working with the land, embedded in that place. And making things out of what they have grown, and parts of the storytelling aspects to it. There's thinking through the issues, and it's, I suppose, in a sense, a way of creating a new set of myths or stories or understandings, which seems to me to be an incredibly fertile area for discovery, and is something that I would love to do. But there's also quite a lot in a more sort of like spiritual side of it, of, you know, the idea that perhaps we could, you know, evolve into a sort of like different state of more connected consciousness. And I always feel that that there's something that has to be engaged with, not just what we're thinking and feeling. And I don't, there seem to be a lot of different courses and a lot of different groups of people who want to move in a direction towards an earth harmony, but there's so many, and it seems quite difficult to know how you would ever choose between them and what the most what the soundest ones were. Sorry, Mary-Jayne.
It's difficult to sift through all the different options because they are blossoming at the moment in terms of lots of different courses. I mean, when I first started running courses, before I really brought this into working with individuals in my therapy practice, when was it? Sort of around 2004, I met up with an outdoor educator, Dave Key. I knew I wanted to work with groups in the wilds, and he was doing it already, but he felt a bit out of his depth psychologically, so he was looking for a therapist to work with. And so together we started running courses up in Scotland, and we called them Ecotherapy courses. And in part it was participants we often had a funny combination of young men who wanted to train to do outdoor work and older women therapists who wanted to learn a bit more about working outdoors. So it was an interesting mix, and we worked in an amazing place on the west coast of Scotland. That was really my first initiation into working outdoors. And that was one of the very first ecotherapy courses to appear on the scene in this country, although they were certainly happening in the States. And of course, there were others happening that certainly weren't called ecotherapy. So people have been running, quote, vision quests for a long time, things like that.
One of the aspects of that people could bring or could feel was particularly appropriate to bring to someone who worked outside or with nature as a co-facilitator might be the area of eco-anxiety. And I think that's something that you feel quite strongly about.
Yes, actually, I want to return to your word of nature as co-facilitator, because I think it's an issue. It's an issue for me anyway. It's a phrase that's used quite a lot. Think that, say, with me and my clients and with our backs against the oak tree, I'm happy to think of the oak tree as hopefully helping us together with the therapeutic work and the beings in the forest. But when you think of nature, it's such a funny word, really, because it means so many different things. In its widest sense, nature with a capital N is everything. It's the greater whole. And for me, because I see nature as infused, it's not just a biological entity, it's infused with spirit or energy. It's alive in the same way that we're alive. I would say I'm an animist in a way that I would say that other beings have consciousness, different kinds of consciousness. Don't want to get into the argument of human, what is consciousness is very complicated, but I think we all dwell in a conscious whole. And so to start calling that my co-facilitator seems a bit grand.
Yeah. Put it in those
terms. Like saying God's my co-facilitator. So that's why I'm a little bit wary of saying nature as co-facilitator, but I certainly think that other beings could help in the process. So you asked about eco-anxiety, which is, I think, has been very much in the media in probably the last 2 or 3 years at least, increasingly, and it's a word now that's come right into the mainstream. And I suppose the first thing I want to say is that I'm very wary of it becoming a kind of medicalized term, as if people who are suffering from eco-anxiety need to go and see a therapist. Well, I guess if it's got really bad and you're unable to function, then probably therapy is a good route. But for goodness sake, find a therapist who's sympathetic to and knows about ecotherapy, because many therapists don't work in that way. And they might mistakenly think that the anxiety is really about your dad or your mum and not really about the world. So really, I'd rather think of it as a healthy response to a sick situation, a sick society. That we are in a crisis. We are in a very extreme environmental crisis with no apparent turning it around. I mean, lots of people are trying, but it all feels a little bit too little and too late. Maybe it will turn around in the end, you never know, but it doesn't look like that at the moment. So no wonder people are frightened. And then, of course, you can't really separate it from all the social crises going on at the moment. The crisis in Ukraine is going to contribute, it's the main producer of wheat. It's going to contribute to the ecological crisis. And of course, war in this kind of war is contributing to carbon emissions. So everything all goes in together. These crises are inseparable. But when someone comes to me with eco-anxiety, I suppose they simply need to be listened to in the same way that I would listen to any other anxiety. It's helpful to name, in a sense, it's an umbrella term. And of course, then you find underneath that actually the person is fearful, is angry, is despairing, feels helpless, feels hopeless. There are all kinds of ways in which naming what's going on can really help someone move through it, accept that it's there, make friends with it, and allow it to move away. Unlike most other anxieties, this is something that is not going to actually go because the situation isn't going to go. So then we have to think about how can we actually practically help it. But I wouldn't rush to a practical solution to begin with. As with any psychological problem that someone brings me, I wouldn't try and give them a quick fix. We want to talk about it first. And maybe it does relate to other anxieties that the person is having. But eventually, there may come a time where that person also wants to take some sort of action, because that may relieve some of the anxiety. So getting involved with the numerous different groups that are taking action. Maybe it's planting trees, maybe it's joining Extinction Rebellion. There's numerous different ways in which people can get active, but I would say, don't try and jump into it too soon.
That's always my response to everything, is to try to respond to it immediately rather than taking due time. In your final chapter of the book, and I think this sort of leads on somewhat, you'd say, and let me just sort of quote a sentence that I've got written on my screen. Our task now is to restore balance in ourselves and in the collective. This means paying attention to both individual and collective action. This is where I place my hope that whatever the future outcome, whether we find renewal of life on Earth or whether humans and many others of our relatives become extinct before the end of the century, we can still work toward restoring balance as far as possible. Repairing our relationship with others is always worth attending to right to the end. And I found that is the call, it seems to me, to have this change of the way that we think about nature with the capital N, and feel ourselves to be part of it rather than the sort of stepchildren that we seem to think we are. And do you suggest that you feel that ecotherapy, ecopsychotherapy can play a part in this kind of transformation?
I think it can. And actually, what I'd like to add to what I was just saying about eco-anxiety is that really people who are concerned about the crisis, it's much, much better to, rather than going into therapy, to band together with other like-minded people, go to a climate cafe, for example. And somehow we can do this, we need to do this together. So there is an organization called the Climate Psychology Alliance, which organizes things like climate cafes and other events, so that you can then start to meet other people who have the same sorts of anxieties. And that's a huge relief, actually, to find that other people feel the same way and that maybe they've gone a little bit ahead of you in terms of finding some solutions or finding some ways of dealing with their feelings. So I would really highly recommend that. And I'll also talk about websites later. But I think, yes, there is a transformation that's possible. I've certainly found that in my own life. Mm-hmm. And I think there are several key things for me in this. The first is how difficult it is to sit with the grief for what's happening to our world. At the same time, finding places of hope. And it's not really even hope, I would say. It's more like, actually, there are places where I can find joy, and there are places where I can deepen my relationship to the non-human world. That, for me, has been amazing. It's been amazing. And it's almost like your mother is on her dying bed and you have a conversation about the terrible things that have happened between you. And she tells it like it is. And you tell it like it is. And you really hear each other. And then, there is a possibility for forgiveness. How incredible. And then she dies. Well, the death is made much better by coming together, to really coming together. And I think it's a little bit like that with the earth. We may not be able to save this situation, but at least let's recognize what we've done, how we've treated nature, how we still, as a species, we're so arrogant. We think that we're superior to the rest of life. This is something that can shift. And we can really recognize the true wisdom of plants and animals and the other than human world. I think if we can do anything as the ship is going down, goodness, let's try and do that, because maybe that will contribute to turning it around anyway. So it's a vital piece of action. So I think holding together grief and possibilities of things that we can do, action we can take, is a really difficult challenge, but it's possible to hold what we would call the tension of opposites in the Jungian world, to stop the polarization from splitting things apart, which it's happening all over the place. You can see politically around the world, everything's tending to split apart and become very black and white. Goodness, let's try and keep making the middle ground. We must keep making the middle ground and hold the tension of the opposites. And the other thing I would say is about, as far as we possibly can, keeping our hearts open and having compassion. It's very easy. I do it regularly, getting very angry. I'm angry with Putin. I'm angry with Trump. I'm angry with lots of men in power. And of course, it's not just men either, and so on. And a lot of people say humans are a bad lot. It'll be a good thing when we're wiped out. I don't think that. We're a mixture, just like everything's a mixture. So let's have some compassion for where we've got to. Let's have some compassion for how somehow we seem to have become very traumatized as a culture. And most people are doing their best, actually, to survive. It's really hard.
There's so many things have come up for me there, and one of them is I've been writing a piece of work on the ethical importance of animal cultures, and first of all, it was the elephant has a multi-generational complex family unit, and that harm to one of those individuals, and particularly the matriarch elephant is harm to all members of the troop. And so I've been very influenced by Gabe Bradshaw's work on PTSD in elephants, and how the breakdown of the elephant culture led to pathological behavior, or just behavior that would be classified as PTSD type behavior in terms of aggression and violence among young male elephants, and the analogies between that and humans. But and so that sort of strikes me as what you were saying right at the beginning, the way in which our culture has cut itself off from its engagement within wider nature is something of a cultural breakdown that we've all experienced. As you said, that there is this trauma, there is this damage that we then have to deal with these various prosthetics of consumerism or power or what have you, because we don't have that thing that we used to have, which was this intact culture. And the process of exploring animal cultures has led me down some fantastic and wonderful rabbit holes, which I is irrelevant here. But that was one thing. The other thing that what you were saying brought to mind was, I was recently listening to a James Hollis book, the Jungian writer, and he used a term that I hadn't come across before about the positive shadow. And I had also been reading naturalist John A. Livingston's book, The Rogue Primate, about in which he posits the idea that non-human animals, for non-human animals, the egoic self is just a very small nested part of the whole self with a capital S, and that this expands out into a sense of a group identity, a collective identity, and perhaps even a biospheric sense of self, that this consciousness is not stuck in the bone skull of each individual, but is expansive and can be shared between family, between community, between ecosystem. And certainly when you spend a lot of time with animals, as Barbara Smuts did in her work with baboons, she felt that in the troop of baboons, and you see it when you watch a flock of birds. So taking this all together, I started to wonder whether the positive shadow that we are suppressing is that whole wider sense of self with a capital S that we don't want to be aware of, that we're pushing away, and that rather than evolving into a new sense of consciousness, we need to rediscover what's there, what we've hidden, what we haven't allowed to become visible.
Exactly. I couldn't really say it any better than you just said it.
Oh wow, that's some commendation. But does that feel to you as if that's the kind of way that you think too?
Very much so. So I was thinking as you were talking, one of the ways in which we've got into such a muddle is it's not just not being related to the other than human world. We don't any longer really respect our animal selves. We don't like to think of ourselves as animals. There's a thick black line between us and the rest of life, and there's a thick black line between what we believe to be human and what we believe to be our animal selves, and we project our shadow onto the animal self. And at actually the positive shadow, or the golden shadow, as some people call it, is only retrieved when we can do the work of lifting out what we've repressed. And in that is buried all the stuff that we're scared of. Like, for example, most people think of our animal selves as these, like a werewolf, aggressive, wild, uncontained, sexually disinhibited. I mean, animals, maybe they are a bit like that sometimes, but most of the time they're not like that. And actually humans are like that a lot of the time too. Humans get aggressive because generally they're defending something, and so do animals. And so on. You can go on and on and on like that. So once we've taken that out of the bag, then we can begin to see, so I've packed away not just my wild aggression, but I've also packed away my sensual nature. I've packed away my intuition. I've packed away my instinct, because somehow they've all got baggaged away under the same label of animal, and I don't trust it. That's what's happened in our culture, that we've retreated from our bodies, and apparently the mind is the only thing now, the rational mind is the only thing to be trusted. Intuition got burnt at the stake. And even though the advertising industry will tell you that we rely on it all the time, we don't like to admit that we rely on it, not really. Jung has this way of thinking about the mind in terms of 4 functions: thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. And so it's really the thinking that's up here in the mind, and the sensing and the intuiting and the feeling are all located in the body. They're all bodily functions. And we need all of them to steer the ship, as it were. They all need to be at the table for all our decision making. And in fact, that often happens without people really admitting it. If you go and buy a house, you're going to step in and you're going to get a feel of it. Or an intuition comes in, you think, oh, no, not that one. I don't think it's not the right time.
Can I ask you, I've always been a little bit confused with the thinking, feeling, sensing and intuiting, because I haven't been able to distinguish the other ones. I mean, I know what thinking is, and I think sensing is about the senses, isn't it?
Exactly, yeah.
But what's the difference between feeling and intuiting?
Well, it's a very good question, and it might take me rather a long time.
Oh, sorry. Well, I got the impression from one of Stephen Hardin's latest book that maybe feeling was about the kind of value of something, whereas intuiting was about an understanding.
Yes,
something.
Yes.
Is that?
But I think the main thing is that all of those things have been packed away, and actually they are part of our animal nature. Animals are very good at picking things up, at intuiting things. I mean, obviously they're very good at sensing things, we know that. But we are too, and we can develop those capacities. They're like muscles that we've forgotten how to use. We can really develop them.
I'll just ask you one more question, Mary-Jayne, before I then ask you to consider if there's anything that you wanted to particularly bring up before we go. But my last question is about the non-animals, and I get the impression from what you've been saying that the tree world, the plant world, is equally as important to you. I feel that, and one of the things that I've been struggling with lately is that when the moral circle expands to include all sentient beings, that still to me seems like it's just not going far enough. And I find it quite difficult to sort of articulate that. And I don't know, but either in the ecopsychology aspect, the study, or in any of the work you've done with clients, whether plant or vegetation is as influential as animals and birds have been.
I think it's different for different people. I used to see someone who had quite a severe eating problem, and along the way she developed a passion for gardening, which she'd never tried before, and of course it was very soothing and helped her eating problem. And then she got an allotment, which for any listeners outside the UK is like a community garden where she was able to grow her vegetables, and the plants started to speak to her. The plants started to say, you know, I need to go here, or you need to give me this supplement, or, you know, whatever it was. I'm sure it wasn't a supplement, but anyway, the plants would tell her what they needed. So she just had a natural gift for listening to plants. Whereas I think I have been more animal centered, and in my ecopsychology journey, I've needed to learn more about listening to plants. Trees, I think, I've always had a love for trees, but actual plants. So I think different people sense different, are closer to different beings. But, you know, there's a lot of green-fingered people out there in this country who talk to their plants.
I genuinely felt that after the tree surgery that I thought had killed my aged lilac, I genuinely felt that my sort of expressions of love and compassion helped bring her back into
life. Yes. There are some amazing stories like that, actually.
And so Mary-Jayne, I know I've taken up a lot of your time today, but is there anything that you feel that we haven't covered properly that you'd really like to bring out for the listeners and viewers?
Well, I think a lot of people ask, so what's my next step in terms of reconnecting with nature? And I would say just a simple practice of going out each day, finding a spot that you love to be in, asking permission if you can sit in that spot, and just see what happens. Open yourself to meeting the animals, the butterflies, the birds, and the plants that are around you, and see what moves through you, and see what the connections are between how you're feeling that day and what comes. Last year I was due to have a tooth out, and I was very anxious because it was I'd been referred to a different dentist who was a man who I'd never met. And so the day before, I went and sat on the heath in a spot that I love, and a robin came to me, and then the robin jumped on my knee, and then the robin jumped on both knees. And then the robin did this many times over, which I'm absolutely amazed by. And of course, I went away and felt much more relaxed, and the tooth extraction went fine, I'm pleased to say. But, you know, I went back to the same spot. It never happened again. It was really, really interesting how these sorts of things happen when you open the space for it. And I think the other thing I would say is, in terms of finding your niche, to offer something back to the world at this most perilous time. There's a lovely quote by someone called Frederick Buechner. Wouldn't necessarily use his language, but anyway, he says, "The place God calls you to is where your deep gladness and the world's hunger meet." And I just think that's such a beautiful quote.
It is.
That go and do what you love doing the most in the service of the earth. Don't go and do what you think you should do, because you'll get burnt out. Think about your gifts and think about what you really love doing, and bring that joy to the earth in some way. Everyone will find a different way of doing it. If your passion is trees, go and plant trees. If your passion is being a community person, go and speak to people about what's happening. Find a way, join a group, so on. There are just countless ways to offer to be in service.
That's beautiful. A lovely place to end. And I know that earlier you'd mentioned some websites, so perhaps if you email them to me, we can add them to the show notes. So I can put a note to say that you suggested that people had a look at these. Mary-Jayne, thank you so much for your time, and we've been delighted to have you on Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thank you.